our own correspondents, weekend pool duty, and holidays in Plains, Georgia. Hardly dangerous duty, but it was an all male press corps, except for some star women at the time: Judy Woodruff, Leslie Stahl, Ann Compton, uh, notably among networks, but all facing a lot of pressure in a white male press corps and a white male White House staff predominantly. So all of those cross currents. Again, now we face very different challenges and have had new successes. We have 4 women lead correspondents for the networks, but at the same time, they've just gone through 4 very difficult years where they were tied to their phones 24/7, more so than any other previous time, because the President of the United States was using his phone on Twitter and sometimes making major announcements in the middle of the night. So aside being chained to that and having more access to the president than in any previous presidency, I think they would agree. There weren't daily news briefings, and when there were, they were not of any credibility. All traditions were sort of thrown to the wayside. Unlike other beats in Washington, they still had travel with the White House press corps, which we did not have at the State Department or at the Pentagon. But most norms were broken down. And in addition, there was challenging, shall we put it kindly, comments from the president, often aimed in with all the access at women in particular and women of color in particular. So how did they deal with all of that and how much has changed? Here are my friends. Kristen Welker, NBC News Chief White House Correspondent and co-anchor of Weekend Today. Nancy Cordes, CBS News Chief White House Correspondent. Cecilia Vega, weekend anchor for ABC News and ABC News Chief White House Correspondent. And Kaitlan Collins, CNN Chief White House Correspondent. Welcome all. This is the greatest get together for me and all of you viewing because we haven't seen each other for the most part during the pandemic. And 3 of the 4 of you were my seatmates, trailmates as road warriors on the Hillary Clinton campaign back in 2016. So we have a lot of shared experiences. First of all, let me go around the horn. Cecilia, first to you, to ask all of you, why did you become a journalist? And what did it mean to you to become a journalist?
Andrea, first of all, it's so good to see you and all of you guys. I just got kind of giddy when we all popped up on the screen. It's so fun. I think I became a journalist for the exact reason of what I'm doing right now. I am in a hotel room in Dallas. I'm changing planes. I'm heading back to Washington after being at the border for a week, and we were interviewing kids, young children who had just crossed, and it's to share their stories. I was reminded this week myself, after all these years in this business, this is why we do what we do, to give a voice to the people who don't have a voice, whose stories are not being heard. And it sounds trite, but I think it's why we all got into this. And I'm heading back so that I can go take those stories to the president for a press conference tomorrow. It's to hold power accountable. And it's simple. That's it. That's why it's to tell those stories.
Simple and so complicated and such responsibility. Kaitlan, you are not only a road warrior, but someone who got through the Trump presidency and was so persistent and dealt with a lot of the reactions. What was it like to stand up and face the President of the United States, who was more than the usual amount of hostility when a tough question is asked?
Well, you're right about that. There was a lot of hostility. And I think that anyone on here would know that was kind of how we prepared ourselves going into press conferences and briefings, was knowing that, this is a president who did not pull any punches and was ready to push back when he didn't like the question that you asked. But I think that something we quickly learned from former President Trump was oftentimes those were deflection tactics to try to not answer your questions. So really the most important thing you could do was to persist and to continue to try to get an answer to what you were asking.
And to Nancy Cordes, we've had our mornings together at 6 a.m. at the Westchester Airport, trying to get ready for the morning news in rain and wind and all the rest. What was it like to be back on the Hill with all the exciting stories on the Hill, and then to most recently experience January 6th before you transitioned to the White House?
Well, first I want to say that a not insignificant part of the reason that I got into journalism in the first place is because when I was in college, a pioneering network correspondent named Andrea Mitchell came to speak at Career Day at the University of Pennsylvania, very dedicated about coming back to doing that. And I was really inspired by what she had to say. One of many moments where she would play a pivotal role in my career. So I want to say thank you to you, Andrea, for that. I promised myself, I know everyone is, that this is not just going to turn into an Andrea Mitchell fan panel, but I just had to get that out of the way. January 6th came just as I was winding down 12 years of covering the Capitol and about to transition over to the White House. And I think none of us really could, it was really a failure of imagination. None of us really could imagine that the Capitol would be breached in that way, because we had never seen anything like it. If you cover Capitol Hill, protests are a way of life. You see them day in and day out, and Capitol Police are so good at handling them. But normally, these are protesters who are looking to make a point, and they're happy to get arrested because that's part of the message that they're trying to send with sit-ins and the like. And so to see people streaming into this building that we really revere, which is, is so symbolic of the power of democracy around the world. It was, at first, you just couldn't even believe what was happening. Luckily, I wasn't in harm's way that day, but many of my colleagues were. And I think a lot of us, were shell-shocked that day, but as the days went on, sort of grew progressively angrier about what had happened. And, these Capitol Police officers, we're friends with them. We see them every day. I know them by face, some of them I know them by name, and knowing what they had gone through was really heartbreaking.
Now, I was formerly a chief congressional correspondent for NBC, and I could only imagine reporting on it. We were anchoring it as it evolved. I could only imagine the corridors that I had been walking through, and you lived those years for 12 years. And I should point out Haley Talbot, my former producer, who's now up on the Hill, was the pool reporter representing all the networks up in the gallery where Jayapal and Jason Crow and others were, really under threat, and shot all of that video on her iPhone. Kristen Welker, my friend, you were there in the cubicle, in the booth, showing the world the reality of the small space, pandemic nonetheless, and what you've been through, the pressure you've been through. We've all been under pressure. All of us have experienced White House news conferences, but that last debate was about as high stakes an event as any of us could imagine. The hard work and preparation that went into it. How did you keep your cool?
Well, a good question, Andrea. With the help of amazing colleagues like you, and just to underscore what Nancy said, you really blazed the path for all of us. And I think we're just all so grateful and honored to be here today. And I'm just so honored to be with all of my colleagues and fellow Chief White House correspondents. I'm so proud of them. And we've all been obviously watching Cecilia's incredible work at the border over these past several weeks. The way that I prepared for that debate was literally, Andrea, you were a part of the preparation process. It was hours a day from 6 a.m. in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, if not later, a lot of weekends. And I say this again, not just to heap praise on you, Andrea, but because it's true. I did it with an incredible team. Andrea was a part of that team. We spent a lot of hours during the day, but also weekend nights going over questions again and again and again to make sure that they were sharp enough and to make sure that they were getting at the key points that we wanted to make. And I go back to what Cecilia said, which was the entire purpose of that debate. And I think what we all wanted to keep in mind as we prepared for that debate was that we were there. I was there on that stage asking questions on behalf of the American people 12 days out before the election. And so I wanted to make sure every single question stayed true to that broader goal that we had. And so in order to prepare, it was about doing the homework, doing mock debate sessions, but also calling people all across the country, Democrats, Republicans, independents, undecided voters, waiters, waitresses, people who worked in large corporations, people who'd been laid off, to get a sense of what people were thinking, what people cared about, and what people wanted to know 12 days out before the election, and what was going to help them really make their decision. And so I saw that moment. It was a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, but I just took it very seriously and tried to really take myself out of it and make it about asking the questions that I thought Americans wanted to hear at that pivotal moment.
Well, that's kind of a critical issue, because it's at risk. You want to be tough, let's say at a debate, certainly, but also in a presidential news conference, and you're all preparing for one tomorrow. How do you balance, Kaitlan, asking a tough question, trying to get a follow-up question, but you not becoming part of the story? Kaitlan, that's to you. I'm sorry, there are 4 of you, and I've got to remember to remember. So Kaitlan, I think you got to unmute.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think that is a critical aspect of it, because I think that's also a way to build credibility with viewers, because your audience is not just those who, for those of us in television who are watching your channel, it's for really the broader audience that Kristen was talking about. And so I think by taking yourself out of it, that helps you establish that credibility, because it doesn't seem like you have any skin in the game. You're just there really acting as a vessel, asking that question for someone else. And so I think that is a tactic that a lot of politicians have tried to use, but certainly one that Trump tried to use time and time again. He tried to make it a personal fight. That's why that debate that Kristen moderated, that one, and then also like the current president that we have now on the other side of the stage. And so I think that's critical to keep in mind, because as long as you can keep yourself out of it, focus on the work and not yourself, that really helps you establish that credibility. So then your audience is more receptive when you're telling them what you're seeing happening at the White House.
Cecilia, how has your past international reporting, and now you're reporting down at the border, influenced your White House role and the way you perceive your White House role?
I want to answer. Can I piggyback on something Kaitlan just said? I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think the women were the ones in the last administration who turned the exchanges with the president into anything about themselves. Maybe I'm not supposed to say that. I think that's
suggesting that. I was saying that he did it.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, I think that's the easy route, and a lot of people took it, and it became this kind of showboaty thing that isn't anybody on this call's style at all. And
was a man or several men.
Yeah, several. Yeah, like it became kind of a shtick, and I think a lot of us kind of went like, "Oh, that's that's not my style." So yay, girls. Look, I think all stories are local stories. All stories end up leading back to the White House. I think there's an opportunity in covering the Biden administration to do things a little differently than we did with Trump. Covering the Trump White House, and we all know, it was drinking from a fire hose, and it was just like 12 storylines a day and barely making air. And there wasn't an opportunity, in my experience anyway, to get out and do the type of story that we're all going to be doing right now. And there is, I think it is a great way to cover the White House, not from inside the White House. That's kind of what I'm trying to do a little bit more. And so the border is one of those stories, international stories, certainly, but it's all local. It all leads back to the White House. I kind of don't differentiate an international reporting experience from a domestic one. I mean, that's certainly your resume. You've got, it all lands back in your lap, no matter who you're asking questions to, right? They're all responsible for whether it happens overseas or whether it happens here. So I just think that there is an opportunity in this White House to get out a little bit more. And if they're doing something on the Keystone Pipeline, to go to the Keystone Pipeline. If the border story is heating up right now, for us to go to the border and take that back to the administration and push them on those issues.
Which is a great approach of widening the lens. Nancy, you've worked on the Hill now for 12 years, and I've always said that was my favorite assignment because you had access to the policymakers, to the principals. They would talk to you in the hallways, and cameras weren't always, available even back then. And after 9/11, much less so. There were so many more restrictions. But tell us the difference between being cooped up in a cubicle the size of Kristen's that we see when you're on duty, and all of the Secret Service restrictions of where you can go and what you can shoot at the White House compared to being able to run around with 435 people.
Right. I used to have no trouble getting my 10,000 steps a day on the Hill because I was always running back and forth from press conferences to hearings. And now I get about 300 steps because while the White House looks so majestic, you're really confined to a very small area. And, you're absolutely right. Capitol Hill is one of the best beats, if not the best beat in Washington for that very reason that you can have face-to-face access with the actual decision makers, the people who are making the policy, the people who are voting. And that is such an incredible thing to experience. One of the nice things about covering the White House, I'm finding is, and you probably know this better than anyone, is, one of the best ways to cover the White House is to go to your Hill sources and find out, what they're hearing from White House officials, especially if you can't get that information from White House officials themselves. So those relationships do come in handy, especially because it's so difficult right now in the midst of a pandemic to have the types of coffees or lunches that you might try to set up to do source building on a new beat, because White House officials in particular are being extremely cautious, as they should be, about meeting people in person during the pandemic. They don't even meet each other in person for the most part. Even if they're all in the White House, they really try to limit face-to-face interaction right now. So it has really kind of reminded me that those Hill relationships are really going to come in handy, especially since so much of this president's agenda has to do with legislation, big legislation that will have to make its way through Congress.
Kristen, let's talk about diversity and the difference now, not only in the press corps, but in the cabinet and the White House staff. As I say, when I first started covering Jimmy Carter part-time and then Reagan full-time, it was a very different experience. And the dominant voices then, really the loudest voices were some of our male colleagues, although I did my fair share of shouting over the helicopters and that whole business of I can't hear you. But a lot of that was fake. But now you've got accessibility, diversity. And what difference does it make that there's now a press briefing with a real press secretary as compared to what some of the incarnations of press secretary in the past 4 years at least?
Well, and I think to your first point about diversity, Andrea, and I would just note that it's something that we're talking about this week as there's been all of this scrutiny on President Biden's cabinet and is it diverse enough? And that's obviously one of the storylines that we continue to cover. But I go back to just 10 years ago when I got to the White House and sitting in that briefing room and really being one of the only or one of the very few women of color to be sitting in the briefing room asking the press secretary questions. And now, I just get so excited to see that not only are there these all-female Chief White House correspondents, in addition to, of course, my good friend Peter and Peter Ducey over at Fox, but that there are more diverse people in that briefing room as well. And I think that's so important because I think that newsrooms should reflect the country, the people that they serve. And the only way to do that is to make sure that there is a diversity when it comes to the people who are sitting in that briefing room, but also the people who are just working in the newsrooms. And one of the things I'd like to see more of, frankly, is support for women of color, as they are entering the business, to make sure that they have the support, they have the training that they need so that they're not falling through the cracks. And I think that that's so important. I think the fact that the, White House press corps is increasingly more diverse is a function of the fact that we're getting better at that. We're not there yet. There's still a lot more work to be done. I know that at NBC, we have this 50-50 initiative where it's 50% women, 50% diverse workforce, which I'm proud of. But again, I think there's a lot more work to be done in that regard. But I am heartened when I look around and I see the increase in stepped up diversity in the briefing room. In terms of having briefings, it certainly adds a structure to the day, and it means that we have to be on our toes, and we have to be not just keeping our eye on the ball, but we have to sort of be ahead of it and thinking about what's coming down the pike and making sure that we're not just read in on the policies that we're covering, but that we really understand all the various different aspects of them. And Nancy kind of spoke to this. It's not just about talking to the folks here at the White House, but talking to people on Capitol Hill, talking to people outside of these government structures. What are they hearing? What are they saying? What are we missing? And to make sure that we're bringing that into the briefing room or to the press conference, which we're going to have tomorrow.
And Kaitlan, on the point of diversity, this is something that none of you have experienced, but the anti-Asian discrimination, which we haven't personally experienced, but is so abhorrent and has been so much a part of life, especially for women of Asian background, we're talking about for centuries now in this country. But what happened in Atlanta, certainly reflects the kind of bias, and a lot of people are blaming the rhetoric from President Trump with China virus and Wuhan virus and some of the other slurs, and in particular the way he demeaned a CBS correspondent who is of Chinese background. Have you experienced that, witnessed a lot of that coming from the White House during the pandemic?
Well, I think certainly it was a little shocking, but maybe not surprising when we started to see that happening amid the outbreak of the pandemic. And, with the colleague that you're referencing, Wei Zhejiang, I can remember when she came out that day and said that a senior official in the federal government being paid by taxpayers had made that comment to her about a name that people were using to refer to the pandemic. And she didn't disclose who it was, but I can remember that day that there were conversations in the White House about who could have said it. And what we had heard from officials was that multiple people had called it that. And so I think that it was something that started from the top with former President Trump, of course, him calling it the China virus and the other names that he used for it. But we saw, of course, how he contributed in part to what you heard other people use to describe it. And it wasn't even just what he called it, it was the way he responded to questions, like he did in the Rose Garden one day when Ouija was asking a question and he told her to ask China that question that she had. And of course, that devolved into the president fleeing the Rose Garden after he refused to take questions from myself and from other reporters. And so you just saw how it was really there were very few ways that I think people would look back and say that the former administration handled the pandemic competently, but beyond just the masks and the messaging and the policies, also the rhetoric around it, I think was disturbing to a lot of the correspondents covering it as well.
Cecilia, what about harassment against women in general from the public on social media? And at Trump rallies, it was particularly egregious during the campaign. I know some of our colleagues at NBC, Katie Tur and others have written about that. I don't know if you've experienced it or how you handle it.
Yeah, it's disturbing and ugly. There also sort of big umbrella first. I have had genuine fears that any member of the press, our colleagues, would be physically harmed in some way under the Trump administration. I mean, I with just the constant barrage of attacks on us as media, enemy of the American people, and you go to these rallies and he's literally turning crowds against you. I mean, there's nothing that I've ever experienced that feels like having a mass of people turn and jeer at you while you're doing a live shot or standing there watching a rally. And You certainly learned to look over your shoulders as you were leaving those rallies. I don't know about you guys. I'm curious to hear your experience. There were times where I would definitely look both ways as you were leaving the White House, because especially if you're on TV and people recognize you sometimes, and you're sort of like, is this the day there's going to be a crazy out there? I mean, it got to the point where all the networks, I believe, would travel with security to Trump rallies, which is still sort of mind-blowing to think that you're covering the president of the United States, and the networks in this country have to send private security contractors to keep your reporters safe from the American public that's being incited by the president of the United States. I still can't get my head around that one. But just in terms of personal threats, my colleagues here are excellent on Twitter. All of them have a gazillion more followers than I do. I intentionally stay off of Twitter. I use it as a news source, and I scan. I do not engage. I often rarely tweet, perhaps to the detriment of my career. I don't know. I hate it. I think it's a cesspool. I think it's racist. I think it's nasty. I think I am like exhausted with people coming at me in personal ways. If I had the amount of times I've had people, threaten to turn me into ICE or have my family deported. I mean, just the nastiest, ugliest stuff. And I hate it. I stay off of it. And I don't know, it's not necessarily any different now under Biden, but it certainly was a lot hotter then. And it was especially hot covering Hillary Clinton. She is just so polarizing. And if you do a story on Hillary Clinton, I'm sure you guys got it. Just the nasty, sexist, racist vitriol that would come at you in an ugly way was like too much for me.
Nancy, let me ask you about being out on the trail, and the social media reactions also can be so abusive. How do you handle that?
By not looking at it. I mean, I just do whatever I can do to avoid looking at the mentions and reactions. And that's too bad, because there can be, interesting reactions, and you always want to know what the public has to say and to think. But in that forum, it's just not healthy a lot of the times, because it is so vitriolic and misogynistic. And so I've really trained myself to kind of look away and get feedback in other ways. And, I'm with Cecilia. I'm a sort of a sporadic tweeter. Her Instagram game, however, is much, much stronger than mine. But yeah, I don't think it's healthy. I remember another terrific journalist, Carol Costello, once said to me, I can't read the comments anymore, because if I get 300 comments and 270 of them are lovely, I'll only remember the 30 that were horrible. And I think that's true, and it's a lot to take in. So I just try to look at the other way.
Well, all of you are so great. I know everyone wants to ask you questions, so I want the audience to know to open your Q&A portion, your Q&A function, because we're going to have questions and answers for about 15 minutes, we hope. Kristen, let's talk about what lessons you've learned from other correspondents on the beat there with you.
I think the lessons that I've learned, first of all, we all work at competing networks. And something that people might not realize is that we are all genuinely friends, and we support each other and lift each other up. So yes, we all come into work, we give it 150%. We're each trying to, outscoop one another, but we're also just supportive of each other. I mean, I'm listening to Cecilia and Nancy talk about the feedback that, we all get on Twitter. And frankly, it is helpful to be able to talk about that amongst ourselves and to be able to support each other through that. I watch what all of these incredible journalists do and learn lessons from them every day, particularly when it comes to just being in the briefing room or a press conference and asking a good question, asking a question that lands. I think we've all had that moment of saying, wow, she really stood her ground there and got something really important out of the president or out of the press secretary, whoever it might be. And so I think one of the just broad lessons that I've learned from each and every one of these incredible journalists is strength. They all have incredible strength. And I draw from that, and I take some of that every day. And I think we all kind of support each other in uplifting each other in a tough, tough place to work, no matter who the president is.
And Andrea, if I can just jump in with a funny story, during the Clinton campaign, it became pretty clear to Kristen and Cecilia and I, and you as well, that the Clinton campaign was going to do whatever it could to try to keep us away from Secretary Clinton when she was on the rope line after events. And they would actually send these tall interns to stand in front of us and our cameras so we couldn't get up to her. And so we figured out pretty early on that our only chance was kind of to divide and conquer and sort of strategize going in. Okay, you go over there and I'll go over here, and you go over there, and maybe one of us will get lucky because they're going to have to, they're going to have to divide their forces up, and maybe one of us will be able to slip through. So, yes, we all compete against one another, but when you've got to work together, you do it.
And in fact, when I first started, there were usually maybe two women. It started with one, but maybe two women in a network newsroom. And so the general feeling was that we would all become, there'd be a cat fight. We'd be enemies. We'd be fighting for primacy. And it turned out, with my experience in local news, we became best friends with this great woman and one of the great active members of IWMF, Susan King, at the Channel 9, the CBS station here in Washington. I just tell this story because as it has evolved, women have become our best friends. Judy Woodruff, when I first covered the White House, lifelong friend and great anchor of the NewsHour. So women have really become, we've always had each other's backs, no matter how competitive we are. Kaitlan, is that your experience in the newsroom as well?
I definitely think so. And that's two things that made me think of was one, Cecilia's answer earlier, not to beat up on the men in the press briefing room, but I do think the women in there, as we saw in the Trump era, are much more effective at following up on each other's questions. And if they're, often with the last few press secretaries, they were trying to deflect and they just move on to someone else. And I think the way to stop that was to back them up to ask that question. But then also Nancy's story reminded me of once, I think it was actually the Easter egg roll 2 years ago. And Kristen and I were out there, and somehow, that's not typically a venue where you would get a question to the press. We saw President Trump coming our way. And so we were kind of scheming of what's a question we could get to kind of hook him and bring him over to us. And then how could we follow up with something, I believe, on the Mueller investigation or impeachment. And it successfully worked. And I remember after we were so excited that our plan that we had devised in a matter of like 30 seconds had worked to not only get him over there, but to get him to answer our question for the news of the day.
That's a great story from the Easter egg roll, no less. Cecilia, what young upcoming women journalists are you excited to see grow? I mean, and maybe to broaden it to way to mentor younger women so that there is a great pipeline of women journalists?
I'm so lucky. I had folks at ABC, I was a newspaper reporter and they literally taught me how to do TV. I know Kaitlan probably has the same experience. And so I am indebted to the women who showed me how to do this, the Martha Raditzes, the Diane Sawyers. I mean, they're still to this day mentors and friends. And so I feel this very heavy sense of responsibility when it comes to bringing up others with me. And I didn't realize the magnitude of these jobs that we had until ABC announced it. I don't know if you guys, I'd be curious to hear if you feel the same way. The first of us, whatever this is, but that first, until people, young women particularly, reached out and they said, wow, this is amazing to see all of these women as Chief White House Correspondents, women of color, women of different backgrounds, women from different, fields. And here we are all doing this in these front row seats at the briefing room. And it sounds trite, but they said, if you can do it, I can do it. And that's the impact, I think, of what we're doing. Like, we may not see it right now, but it's knowing that this next generation that's coming up is going to think there is nothing abnormal about having 4 female Chief White House correspondents. That's a legacy right there, right? It's great to be the first. You don't want to be the last. We've got young people at ABC who I am just wowed by, and their skill and their sense of doggedness and determination to just do boots on the ground reporting. I'm so excited about the next generation of reporters that's coming up, and I look forward to having them in that briefing room with us very soon.
I'd like to ask a question that's been asked here of all of you, because you all have such different experiences. Kristen, first to you. What interview have you done over the years with Congress, with the president, in any format, has been the most meaningful, that really sticks with you as a memorable memory?
I think one of the interviews that sticks with me most is when I interviewed former First Lady Michelle Obama while she was traveling in Africa. And it speaks to this theme that we're talking about, which is, what do you do with the responsibility that you've been given? And in this case, in a number of different stops, she was speaking to reaching out to young women and talking about, the ways in which she wanted to help kind of set the example for them as they were, being educated, growing, developing, figuring out their own passions in life, and that she wanted to be a part of that process in terms of being a role model for them. And so I had a one-on-one interview with her. It was not for very long, but I did ask her about that weight and that responsibility that she feels, and that the importance of being a role model and, passing the torch forward. And it's something that she still talks about out of office to this day. And so I always, go back to that interview in which I not only pressed her on that, but her role in, how she saw her role as First Lady in terms of the extent to which she felt the need to or not to weigh in on policy and that sort of thing. But it's a conversation, I think, that I'll always remember, a really extraordinary experience.
To Nancy, I have a question from an anchor in West Virginia, asking, an evening news anchor, what advice do you have for journalists in their first market one day, hoping to reach that network or national level? Nancy?
Well, I would say that congratulations on getting that first job, because I really think that getting the first job is the hardest. And believe it or not, it really gets easier from there. I know so many young journalists who wanted to become reporters and got dissuaded and went into other lines of work just because they had so much trouble landing that first on-air job. So you've already won half the battle by getting that job in West Virginia. And you will find that just opens so many doors for you, because as someone who worked at a local station myself, lucky enough to go back home to Hawaii after college and worked at the local NBC affiliate there for a couple of years, you meet people who move on, and then you've got a contact at another TV station, or you met somebody once at a conference and you kept their card, and you just kind of keep climbing the ladder that way. And I've always found that doors opened where I didn't expect them to open, but they always led somewhere interesting. So I would say that, your persistence, you've already got persistence if you've gotten that first job. And I'd also say that one of the keys to my success, and I'd wager everyone who's on this panel's success, has to do with writing and really caring about the craft of writing and being a good writer. I remember when I was at ABC before I came to CBS, and I was trying to move up the ladder there. And, what I had to first prove that my writing was good enough to get me onto weekend GMA. And then once that happened, I would have to sort of prove that my writing was good enough to get onto the weekend evening news, and then onto weekday GMA, and then onto weekday evening news. And I think, time and time again, I've just seen that if you are a good writer and they know they can rely on you to write a great script, and a hard worker and willing to work overnights at many points in your career, you'll go really far.
Amen to all of that. Kaitlan, How do you overcome the fear of asking a tough question and stand your ground? And maybe what's the toughest exchange you've ever had with a
I
newsmaker?
think the best way to not be fearful about asking a question is to be prepared, because if you know your subject matter and you've got follow-ups in the back of your head and you don't even really have to look at the questions you've written down to be ready, that is the most confident way you can enter a press conference or any kind of situation where you're interviewing somebody, a press briefing. Even, you have to always be prepared at the White House to just kind of catch someone coming out of a random. You really never know who you're going to run into. So just making sure that you're really on top of your game in that sense, I think, is the best way to live confidently and to report confidently and to ask questions confidently. And so I think that was always the case going into any press conference with any lawmaker, especially ones who will often try to turn it around on you by asking a question about something to try to see if it looks like you don't know what you're talking about. And so I think that is something that's been a really key part that I have used since I started at CNN, and especially covering the White House, is realize the weight of what you're doing and that it is not theatrics, it is not for show. You're doing really important work, and you want to make sure that when you actually get that moment that you've been preparing for so long, that you're ready to take it. And I think that, reading as much as you can, talking to as many experts as you can, talking to as many sources as you can is the way that you do that. And that's how I prepared for really any interactions that I had with President Trump and now with President Biden.
And finally, I guess we can squeeze in one more question. There's a question from a Muslim journalist who says that she has countless times heard things in the newsroom or heard inflammatory, racist things, discriminatory comments while covering a story, and was too fearful to speak out. Let me ask you, Cecilia, have you experienced that from your perspective? And have you heard discriminatory comments? And would you now be more confident about speaking out than you might have been earlier in your career?
Oh, I would say certainly to the last question. It takes a long time to feel like you've got your legs underneath you in this business. And there's something, I don't know how to change that in broadcast news, but I do think it's something that does need to change, where particularly on-air people feel an insecurity about their status in the business. There's always someone behind you. And so I think that makes people fearful to speak out, maybe when they should. I think my colleagues at ABC News will tell you I'm not known for biting my tongue anymore. But there was a time where I did, certainly. And I just certainly now try to use my voice as much as I can, because I do know there are a lot of people who feel like they are not empowered enough to speak out. Outright discrimination, have I heard anything? I can't say that I've heard anything that, that would rise to the level of being called outwardly racist. I certainly have felt like perhaps an ask has been made of me that perhaps wouldn't be made to a white man, or, assignments that would come to a woman that wouldn't necessarily go to a man, that make you go like, ooh, that's not cool. But I think I'm at the stage in my career, everybody on this call is at the stage in their career where I think we feel empowered enough to push back. And to the journalist who asked this question, I would just encourage you to speak up if you can, or to go to someone who can help you and speak up on your behalf, to find that ally. If you don't feel empowered enough, if you feel concerned about your job security for speaking out on this topic, find someone who will do it for you, because you should in no way be in a position at a place of work, or anywhere for that matter, where you feel like you're being disrespected in that way. That's not okay.
Well, you are all so incredible. I'm in awe of you, the sisterhood, and the questions were great. We could only get through some of them, but thank you. I've gone over time, but I always do.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you for that amazing conversation. And thanks everyone for watching and asking questions.
Exactly.
See you guys tomorrow.
Elisa? And Lisa is muted. Lisa, you're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So start over.
I-
We want to hear every word.
Thank you. I was saying, Andrea, thank you for listening. And thank you all for joining this conversation today. Please check the chat window and see how you can follow the couple of the. We look forward to seeing you again for our next Press Freedom Speaker Series conversation on April 21st with Kara Swisher and our 2020 Courage in Journalism Award winner, Finnish journalist Jessica Arrow, who they will be discussing the impact of online attacks on press freedom. So you can hear more about how that issue impacts us all. Thank you all and take care.